The Orioles surprised some people on Sunday, taking Enrique Bradfield Jr., the outfielder out of Vanderbilt, with their first-round pick in the 2023 MLB Draft. But today, I'm going to tell you why it was the right choice for the Orioles. That's coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Thursday, July 13th, 2023, and welcome back in to the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb, and coming up on today's episode, we are discussing Enrique Bradfield Jr. He was the Orioles' first-round pick in the draft on Sunday night, taking him number 17 overall, the outfielder out of Vanderbilt. And I'm going to have a guest with me to tell us much more about Bradfield. It is Andrew Allegretta. He is the play-by-play voice of Vanderbilt baseball. He's actually been on this podcast one time before, all the way back in 2020. But 3 years later, Andrew joins us to talk about Bradfield, the elite speed and the elite defense, his progression in his 3 years at Vanderbilt, and what the Orioles could potentially do with the bat to get Bradfield to that next level to make him a slam dunk prospect for the O's. Then little Orioles news and notes on the back end of the pod as well. But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast. Before we get there, just want to thank you for making Locked On Orioles your first podcast listen of the day. Free and available on all podcast listening platforms, right here on YouTube as well. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube page. And thank you to the everydayers out there who make Locked On Orioles your first listen of the day. For your first listen today, we're talking Enrique Bradfield Jr. Again, the O's took him with the 17th pick on Sunday. Now, real speedy outfielder, right? 80 grade elite speed, 80 grade elite defense in center field, left-handed hitter who hit over 330 his freshman year at Vanderbilt in 2021. Then he was closer to about 315 as a sophomore in 2022, but still getting on base at a high rate. Then the average dropped into the 270s in 2023. He was still a good leadoff hitter. He still walked more than he struck out, just as he did his entire career in the SEC, the best baseball conference in college baseball, on a perennial top 10 team in the Vanderbilt Commodores. And he was still hitting leadoff, but showed a little bit of power at times, maybe not as much as people would like. Some people aren't in love with his swing from the left-handed side. Some people don't think the batted ball data is going to project to the next level. But what the Orioles saw was a player who has such a high floor because of the speed, because of the defense, because of the ability to work walks. His plate discipline is incredible. So that player right there is already, you think, going to be a big leaguer no matter what. Now it's up to the Orioles hitting development system to kind of take that bat to the next level. And if there's any hitting development system in baseball that I think can do that right now, I would trust the Orioles, seeing what they've done with all their young hitters in the system over the last few years. It's going to take work, but Bradfield has such a high ceiling and already a high floor that even though he wasn't super on my radar and wasn't on many people's radars at all for the Orioles at pick number 17 in the first round on Sunday night, I think it was a good selection by the Orioles, one of the most electrifying players in the entire draft. And I think the O's could get him even to the next level, especially with the bat in his hands. But I watched a solid amount of Bradfield over the last couple of years. I mean, I am a college baseball fan. He plays for Vanderbilt in the SEC. So you just play him a lot. I mean, Maryland played Vanderbilt this year. I got to see Bradfield in that game as well. But wanted to have someone on who's watching him day in and day out and is calling his games day in and day out. And that is Andrew Allegretta. He is the play-by-play voice of Vanderbilt baseball. And he's going to join us up next to talk about Enrique Bradfield, his career at Vanderbilt, the highs and the lows for him, what kind of player the Orioles are getting. That is coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Sleeper. Now, if you're looking for a new and exciting way to play daily fantasy sports, well, Sleeper might just be the option for you. Because you take a look at the MLB lineups every night, you go on the Sleeper app, you say, you know what? I think Adley Rutschman is going to hit more than this many home runs. I think Gunnar Henderson's going to have this many hits. I think Jordan Westberg or Colton Cowser is going to get on base more than this many times. And you can win 100 times your money on daily fantasy baseball. Sleeper is now offering up to a 100 times payout for up to 8 pick contests. Choose as many as 8 players that you like. Pick more or less on your favorite baseball stats like homers, strikeouts, hits, and more. Get your picks right, and you could win big. And the Sleeper app's super easy to use. All the players are there. You make your entries in 30 seconds or less. It's that easy, and it's safe and fast to withdraw your money. So use the promo code LOCKEDON, and you'll get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. See Sleeper's terms of use for details. Currently operational in over 30 states. Check out Sleeper today. All right, so we are pleased to be joined once again on the pod 3 years later by Andrew Allegretta. He is the play-by-play voice of Vanderbilt Commodores baseball. He is here to talk about Enrique Bradfield Jr., the Orioles' first-round pick. And Andrew, it's been a while, but welcome back to the podcast.
And this time, unlike 3 years ago, I think when we talked, I was sitting in my car. This time I've got a full setup.
Yeah,
and a broadcast booth to talk to you from, so that's
there
fine.
You go. And things look a little different here. Back then, we were audio only.
Yeah,
we probably recorded on Zoom. You got a whole lower third going on here, and we got some topics on the side.
I love it. This looked great.
Moving up in the world here at the Locked On Orioles podcast. But we have you on to talk Enrique Bradfield, and really the first thing to say is Bradfield. Most people thought he's going to probably go in the first round. People thought probably the later half of the first round, but the first round this year. The surprising part was not that he was picked 17th. It was that he was picked by the Orioles because he said in his post-draft press conference, I didn't have much contact with the Orioles before the draft. It was a little surprising. No mock draft had Bradfield there. Mike Elias even said after the draft, he had mentioned before the draft, we're looking at 8 to 10 players. He mentioned after the draft, Bradfield was not one of those 8 to 10 players that he was mentioning before. Something must have all came together for the Orioles to take this pick. Were you at all surprised? Maybe not that he went 17, but just that he went where he did and that he went to the Orioles, maybe after seeing that there wasn't a lot of contact apparently between the two sides before the draft.
It's a good question. I don't have an answer to it. I think like a lot of people, I scrolled through a lot of mock drafts, 1, to see where Bradfield was going to go, and 2, to see where all of our future recruits were going to be taken away from us, which 4 were. I think we could have done better. But we did okay. But for Bradfield, I like you, anywhere from like 11 to 12 with the Red Sox or the Angels, all the way down to the bottom part of the first round. So I had no idea necessarily where he was going to go. And then sometimes you have those late risers, especially the high school prospects that people fall in love with, and the projectability and the analytics and all of that sort of stuff, which is great and valid. And then perhaps that takes a swing at someone like Bradfield, who is exceedingly gifted in a couple of areas. But if you want to poke a hole in his hit game, possibly you could. So I wondered if perhaps he would fall toward the bottom part of the first round. I'm glad that he didn't. I'm glad he went to Baltimore. He is a tremendous, tremendous player, but in terms of where he went, whether it was Baltimore, what the fit in the organization is, I don't really know. You could probably tell me, and the fans could probably tell me better about in terms of how the Orioles go about their drafting prospects. And my understanding is they're as tight to the vest as just about anybody. So perhaps there was a head fake, and I know there's a lot of that in drafting.
Oh, yeah. There's a lot of head faking. There's a lot of head faking to the people that cover the draft to get things in their mock drafts that may not happen. Right. There's a whole lot of that going on. But yeah, it's very tight to the vest in Baltimore. But the one thing I want to start with is the offense, because we can get to the defense. We can get to the speed. Everybody knows what's going on. The question and the reason why Bradfield was not a top 5 pick is because there are questions about the bat. So let's get to it first. And I want to start with probably the reason why the Orioles took him here is the swing decisions and the more walks than strikeouts and the ability to, lay off pitches outside the zone. Like, how have you seen, you've been there watching him every day for 2 years. How have you seen the approach develop when he knows he's not a 20-plus homer hitter? He knows he's not a big power guy who teams are going to pitch around. How does he still at that point draw those walks and get himself on base? Because he is the player where if he gets to first, it's a double.
Yeah, so interesting question. I was digging through it, and I expected the numbers to really elevate, frankly, when I was going through it. So 45 walks last season, 40 strikeouts, more walks than strikeouts. I thought that was going to be a little bit higher for him than it was his sophomore season because And perhaps it was just how the season unfolded. I really felt like his strike zone discipline was high this season. And to be honest with you, that can be difficult in collegiate baseball when you're dealing with good, but perhaps not great umpires. And that's just the truth of it, right? Like the amount of strikes that should be balls or balls that should be strikes is just elevated compared to pro ball. So the fact that I felt like his plate discipline, his strike zone command were really high this season, I think was saying something. In terms of what he can do, what his batting average should be, he's kind of been an interesting case study, at least for me the past couple of seasons. If for no other reason than he's felt like at times a slow starter. So he's got batting averages the past couple of seasons. Let's see how quickly I can find it for you. This season, he was 279. The previous season, he was 317. But I would bet if you took out the month of February and perhaps parts of the month of March, you would see all of those numbers go up. He's been a little bit of a slow starter for whatever that is. And I don't feel like he necessarily capitalized on his speed quite as much as he could have with some infield hits. If you were telling me that he played a little bit banged up this past season, perhaps the season prior at times, I wouldn't be shocked. So I think there's room to grow in terms of batting average and just on base percentage, especially as the strike zone is better and more consistent at the professional level. I wouldn't be surprised if his walk numbers go up, if he's on base more. And if he's 100% healthy, then I think you see the speed take over. I thought he would bunt a little bit more and pick up a few more base hits that way, but is he going to be a 20 home run guy? I mean, who knows? Perhaps there's room for him to get stronger. I know he got a little bit stronger going into his junior season, like maybe put on 10, 15 pounds of muscle. So perhaps there's more of that in his game, but we'll see with the offense. He's a really unique talent. And the fact that whether or not he hits 20 or 30 home runs, I don't know, because I think his strike zone command is perhaps one of his more underrated aspects.
Do you think just from watching him for 2 years, I mean, again, like the knock on him is just there were questions from teams about, is the bat going to be able to get to a major league level consistently? That's kind of a broad thing to say about a player. Do you think it's simply that teams see, a skinnier, faster guy who plays the outfield and say, well, if this guy can't hit 20 homers at the big league level, he's not a player we want to draft in the first round? Or you think it's something beyond that, where when he does, take any of those hits, because again, that's the one reason I would say for a player this electric that it isn't going in the top 10 is because there's some questions there. Do you think it's just like a power thing because the game that's so power oriented at this point?
I might go a slightly different direction on you. I think two things. I've always felt for collegiate players, especially as they step into their junior season, that's a hard year because that's your leverage year. That's the year that if you're going to capitalize the most in the draft, that's when you have to do it. So they feel more weight, they feel more pressure, and sometimes you don't make the perfect decision at the right time because you're not playing as loose as you would like to be. I'm not saying that happened to Bradfield this season, but if you told me occasionally that it did, I'd believe you. And all of a sudden the batting average is 280 instead of 300. That's all it takes. And then the other thing I would add to that is the past couple of years in this conference, everybody understood that when Vanderbilt was at its best, Bradfield was on base. Number one on the scouting report was keep Bradfield off the bases. He had every last bit of attention focused on him. And that's difficult for someone that didn't have quite as much support as you would like in the lineup. Our offense has been fine the past couple of years. In fact, statistically, we've actually been at times close to the top of the SEC. But in terms of those major draft prospects, your Dylan Cruzes, your Tommy Whites, go down the list, whatever it is, Wyatt Langford, we didn't really have one of those guys backing him up consistently for 3 years. Now, Spencer Jones was a first-round draft pick to the Yankees a season ago. Dom Keegan was a very, very, very good SEC hitter, but, people could turn their attention to him. And I suspect that weighed down some of the opportunities for him and just made life as difficult as possible for him. I mean, this past season, Dylan Cruz had Tommy White hitting behind him. Bradfield didn't have that same luxury. So I wonder if perhaps that's part of let's poke a hole in Bradfield here. Let's poke a hole in Bradfield there. I don't know. I thought there would be a little bit more consistency with some singles and bunt hits and all that sort of stuff to bump up the average, but he had life really, really difficult because everybody knew he was the person that made Vanderbilt's offense go.
Yeah, and it's always interesting to kind of think in that way too. Like if you're facing a guy like Tommy White, a guy like a Wyatt Langford, a Kemp Alderman, or whoever it is, a big power hitter in the SEC, you're thinking this guy hits so many homers that if I walk him, I walk him. He's on first base. He's not scoring. They know if they put Bradfield on base at all, he's at second. He might be at third pretty immediately. And it hurts you a lot more to walk a guy like that or allow a single to a guy like that than it does for anybody else. So it kind of leads right into that where they are just so focused on just keeping him off first base that he's probably seeing the least hittable pitches, I would think, in that Vanderbilt lineup.
I would think so. And this is super in the weeds on you, but the guy that batted second for the most part this season is Davis Diaz, who could be a first-round draft pick next season. His glove is incredible, played third base. His hit tool is developing, but I don't have his batting average in front of me. I suspect it's about 275. The reason that he was batting second was not necessarily because he was going to hit the ball out of the yard. It's because he had, next to Bradfield, the second most plate discipline, which was 100% to give Bradfield an opportunity to steal. So again, they didn't stick somebody behind Bradfield that people were petrified of in terms of the bat. He's very, very good, but again, it's not Tommy White or Wyatt Langford or Jack Caglione or whatever. It was someone with great plate discipline, so Bradfield could do his thing. So again, so that takes some of the hittability away from the pitches that he was seeing.
Let's talk about him doing his thing on the base paths, because when he gets to first, and this is something Orioles fans know with Jorge Mateo and Cedric Mullins on their own team, like they get to first, they're trying to get to second. They're trying to walk a single into a double on the base paths. Like, he had the 46 for 46, which was the crazy year. He steals 30 plus this year. Like what's the level of just certainty when he gets to first base against even an SEC pitcher and catcher battery that even maybe not, he got thrown out a few times this year, but just the certainty that like he's going to go before this next at bat is over.
The certainty that he's going to go. That's an interesting question. The certainty that he's going to get to second base, if he goes, is pretty darn high.
Yeah.
Because there's still some really strong arms in the SEC that can throw out even Bradfield or whoever, and they did this past season. I would give Bradfield a lot of credit for understanding situational baseball. He had a green light. Coach Corbin wasn't over there necessarily giving signs 100% of the time. Perhaps it happened occasionally, but for the most part, Bradfield's on his own. And he was not going to go or move if he didn't feel like he could get there and if it wasn't in the best interest of the team. So, I think that's worth noting with him is that he's a smart kid that not only understands how to read pitchers and do it fast, but understand when his team needs him to go and at times when his team doesn't need him to go. He's pretty savvy out there with that kind of stuff. I think it's 37 stolen bases. He finished his career, oh goodness, I think third most in the history of the Southeastern Conference, 130, 131, something like that. It was a pretty remarkable 3 years for Bradfield. Is he perfect? Nah, he gets picked off occasionally, but I don't know that it's for a lack of like feel or pitch choice or first step or whatever. If he gets a bad first step, he can put on the brakes really fast too. So it's as good of a base stealer as I've ever seen. And I understand, there's the conversation around the bases getting a little bit bigger and perhaps it's coming back into the game and who knows, but if there's ever a case study on can the bigger bags reintroduce the stolen base to baseball in a way that it hasn't for the past 10 years, Bradfield's that case study.
Yeah. And a guy who could have pumped his draft value a little bit thinking, hey, when he gets to the big leagues, it's going to probably continue in this direction, maybe even further in terms of stealing bases being in the game. I got to ask about the defense as well, because it's the other tool that just leaps off the page, the ability to cover so much ground in center field. Just the combo of that plus the arm strength, like where does that fall? I think the only thing I haven't even really heard many people talk about is where do the arm play? Like if he doesn't have an 80 grade throwing arm, that's fine because he gets to so many things in the outfield. But where do those two come into play defensively for him?
We saved my favorite for last. I've never seen a more impactful defensive player, not just center fielder, any position player. and a decade plus of working in college baseball. He's the best defensive player I've ever seen, period. I don't have him comped in terms of a defensive center fielder in the past professionally, but I know nobody changed a game defensively in now 12 years of me working college baseball more than Enrique Bradfield Jr. I loved every bit of it. He had a catch at Alabama that it's so cliche to say it looked like Willie Mays, but it certainly was Willie Mays adjacent. You'd have to go back and check it out. I can't remember which game it was specifically versus Alabama. I think it was the second game. I think it was the one that we won that Hunter Owen pitched, who I think ended up being a 4th round draft pick. It was remarkable. You could see his numbers. When you could see the 5 and the 1 as somebody makes a catch, it's as good as it gets. It's not just the speed. He doesn't take a bad first step. And it's not just the mechanics and the motion. He reads the ball really well. He is reckless with his body, which I think you kind of love. Like I can think of a diving catch he made at Hawaii. I mean, it's at Hawaii a year ago. He doesn't necessarily need to put his body on the line, and he does. Every time. He's a 100% all-out defensive player. I am so deeply going to miss watching him play center field, and I hope he gets to Camden Yards as quickly as possible, because I know Orioles fans will love it. Like, would it be great if he hits 350 and can pop 25 home runs and steal X number of bags and all that kind of stuff? Yep. I mean, you need to have all of the tools to be an impactful all-star level player at the bigs. But I would say 50%, if not more, professional teams would let Enrique Bradfield Jr. play center field right now. I mean, that's just going and getting balls and catching them in the whole bit. It's the best defensive player I've ever seen, period, full stop, bar none.
How is the arm? Because I think that's the only thing where people are like, yeah, his arm is not the greatest arm I've ever seen. But again, that's fine when you get to every ball. Yeah,
I don't. It's a good question. I can't say. I'm trying to think back on the past couple of years. I'm trying to think of like times when he's thrown somebody out at home or at third or something like that. I can't really think of any, but again, he's getting to everything. So right. There's just not a ton.
Doesn't need to use it.
There's not a ton of time, or like, the stuff that he'll do that is so, you're thinking, okay, the center fielder, there's a ball to the gap. The center fielder gets it and throws the guy out at third. Wow. He's got a great arm. Well, what Bradfield does is he cuts it off. So It's a single. So you never see the arm. I know there was a play when he was playing for Team USA, the collegiate national team last year, where he threw somebody out at home, and they spoke really highly of that particular moment. So I don't know whatever the scout grade on his arm is, whether it's, a 50 or a 60 or whatever. But I would point to the fact that more often than not, he's going to make a play look average to the point where you don't need to feature his arm.
And I think the last thing I wanted to talk about is just, the other thing we've heard about so far since the draft Sunday is just kind of the makeup of Bradfield, the leadership, kind of being the name this year on this Vanderbilt team. Like, he wasn't always the name at Vanderbilt. There's a lot of big names, but he was, kind of the main attraction for Vanderbilt baseball this year. How do you handle that? And what kind of just person is he in that clubhouse with that group? Because there's pressure when you're hitting leadoff for Vanderbilt baseball. There just is.
The people here would tell you that he took over the leadership role of this team, quote unquote. Whether that was truly full-throated leadership or just people understood that his tempo was the team's tempo as a freshman. And the weekend that they point to was the weekend in Knoxville. He had 4 stolen bases in a game. And I think it's kind of when he burst onto the scene and he took over and eventually became the SEC Freshman of the Year. He's been the heartbeat of the team for at least 2.5 years. And that includes a team that had Kamar Rocker, a team that had Jack Leiter. The pitching staff has always been pretty well buttoned up, but the offense, the mood of it, the feel of it, the tempo of it very much went as Bradfield went. I would say he's an incredible leader. I think he's a great person. There's a lot of times that he would just be in the team meeting room and you could have a conversation with him, or he was just hanging out and he was very approachable, very likable. I don't say this really as a knock, but as just a growth point that I suspect he'll go through. I do think at times they loved his passion and they loved his commit level and they loved the energy that he brought to the team. But there is a certain amount of control that the Vanderbilt's coaching staff, support staff, everybody expects from their players. And I'm not saying he got out of control, but if they want to keep you kind of, I don't know, I'd have to kind of ask them and get a finer point on it and all that kind of stuff. I know at times his emotions go really high and you love to see it and all that sort of stuff. But baseball can be that really challenging game that if your emotions go a little bit out of the parameters, then all of a sudden your ability to think and execute smoothly starts to be a little bit wonky, right? That's the yips or whatever. You know, he never had the yips, and he was never a bad teammate ever, period, full stop. Don't get it twisted. I just know that he could run a little either super excited or, you know, perhaps he has an 0 for 5 day or an 0 for 4 day. And the ability to just let it wash away maybe took an inch longer than you would want it to. There was some of that perhaps. So if that a growth point, is that just getting in there and playing 140 some odd minor league games, perhaps. But you know, he was the guy carrying the boombox to the bus, that sort of stuff. He was the guy that was hanging around the team meeting room, social with everybody, social with his teammates, social with the support staff, social with the broadcaster when 75% of the student athletes either don't know, don't care, kind of do their own thing, which is fine. Doesn't bother me. But, you know, he's the guy that's social with everybody. He was the loudest talker, not in a bad way, but the most vocal one, you know, in the dugouts during BP or whatever it is. Like he brought a lot of personality, positivity, flair, leadership, all that stuff. You've got an A++ human being there in Bradfield. The steadiness, I suppose, and the understanding of the ups and downs and navigating them just like an inch better, perhaps, is his one growth point. But otherwise, A++ human.
Yeah. And one of those things, at least how I see it, is I'd rather have that guy who gets too high or too low and you just try to rein it in instead of the guy who's just the even keel nothing for 24 hours a day.
It's the whoa guy versus go guys. Coaches would rather have a whoa guy that you've got to slow down than one you've got to kick in the butt, because oftentimes you can't kick them hard enough and they'll never go. Yeah. And Bradfield, I don't even know that he's a whoa guy. It's just he's a guy that gives you 100% of his energy all the time. It's just sometimes it's just like you can just see where the when you hit the gas pedal, the pickup is really quick.
Yeah. But
and it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just, you know, moments and when it's the right time to hit the gas and when you need to, if you're going to be a leader, if you're truly going to be a leader and navigate through highs and lows of a baseball season, like you got to be able to control yourself almost to an impeccable standard. And I think he did it to an incredible standard, but maybe not an impeccable standard. Like if we're going to hold him to this really ridiculously high mark because of who he is and what he meant to the team, he did it on like a 95% mark instead of a 100% mark.
Yeah. And I think the Orioles will take that. And I think we've learned today that, listen, the glove is there, the speed is there, the bat is there. The O's are going to get him into their hitting lab, and they're happy with this pick. I mean, Mike Elias said too, he was like, yeah, you know, we didn't talk a lot about Bradfield, but we had him ranked so highly on our board that when he fell to us, we just had to take him. And I think that kind of speaks volumes about how they saw him. I think they kind of assumed he was going in the top 10 and he didn't go. And that's where the O's took him. And so, Andrew, thanks for joining us. It should be fun to see him in this Orioles uniform.
I hope I get to watch him at Camden Yards or wherever. And I'm telling you, like, I love the kid. He's a great person. Fun guy, and you guys will see, it'll pop up on your social media accounts with him playing for whoever in the minors, going like, did he make that catch? Like, yeah, he made that catch. It's the best glove I've ever seen, period.
So we'll get back to finishing up this episode in just a second. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by Bird Dogs. Bird Dogs, the most comfortable and good-looking pair of shorts I have ever owned. I've got 2 pairs of the Bird Dogs. They fit perfectly. They have different fits for every size leg, every size person. They fit you so well. And the fabric The fabric is amazing. It feels so good, and they're so versatile. You can wear the shorts pretty much anywhere. They can look nice, they can look athletic. You can do anything with these shorts. They are especially good, though, with the weather right now in Baltimore. 90 plus degrees and humid pretty much every single day, but the bird dogs keep you cool, and that is huge. They've got anti-stink, sweat-wicking fabric that keeps you cool and dry all day long. I only have 2 pairs. I wish I had 7 pairs of the bird dogs that I could wear every single day during the summer and the spring and fall as well, to be honest with you. So go to birddogs.com/lockedonmlb or enter promo code LockedOnMLB for a free Yeti-style tumbler with your order. That's birddogs.com/lockedonmlb or promo code LockedOnMLB for a free Yeti-style tumbler. You won't want to take your bird dogs off. We promise you that. So, back here on the pod, finishing things up. Thanks again to Andrew for joining us to talk about Enrique Bradfield Jr., his time at Vanderbilt, and what he could do when he joins the Orioles. Couple of O's news and notes to get to here just to finish off the pod, starting with Anthony Bemboom. Remember, the Orioles were carrying him as the backup catcher for a while James McCann was on the injured list. He was DFA'd a few days ago. Bemboom has once again cleared waivers and has accepted his assignment to AAA Norfolk. So Bemboom will stay in the organization. Honestly, yeah, he's not the most impact player, but he is a really nice backup to have if McCann does go down again. I really do trust Bemboom in that backup role, so it's nice to keep him in the organization at this point. Some other Orioles news. Of course, the O's tomorrow will start the second half, hosting the Miami Marlins for a 3-game series, and the Orioles have announced their weekend rotation. Remember, always in the second half, because you get those 4 days off, Monday through Thursday is off, you can basically reset your pitching rotation in any way that you would like. The Orioles have chosen to go this way. Dean Kramer is going to go Friday night against the Marlins. Kyle Gibson will go Saturday, and then Kyle Bradish will go Sunday. That does switch up the rotation a little bit. Kramer and Bradish have been back-to-back for a while this season. So that does leave Tyler Wells and then Cole Irvin. One will presumably go Game 4, Game 5 coming out of the break, and then reset that rotation at some point here. You'd have to think Grayson Rodriguez will be joining them as well, but I don't think it's going to be right out of the All-Star break. And then just a couple of news and notes from the draft. The first one kind of unfortunate, but it was expected. Tanner Witt, the right-handed pitcher out of Texas, who the Orioles selected in the 18th round of the draft on Tuesday, talked about it on Wednesday's pod, how he would probably be the toughest guy to sign. He was so good as a freshman. He was a top 100 prospect in this draft, but was coming off Tommy John surgery. Barely pitched at all really since 2021. And when he did pitch this year, coming back from the surgery early, he was not very good. And so because he's such a high prospect, you figured, okay, he wants a lot of money to sign. If he doesn't get it, he's going to go back to Texas, pitch healthy, be an ace, and probably be a first-round pick next year. So the Orioles selected him in the 18th round just in case, one of their top picks didn't sign. They could allocate that money to Tanner Witt. Well, we're not even going to get that far because on Wednesday afternoon, Tanner Witt posted a graphic on Twitter, said unfinished business with the horns up emoji, and essentially was saying, hey, I'm coming back to Texas for another year. So don't think the Orioles are going to be able to sign Tanner Witt, although I will say pretty much was expected from the moment that they drafted him. But the Orioles did add a player in his place. They have their first undrafted free agent signing of the post-draft period. Generally for about 2 weeks after the draft, you'll see undrafted free agent signings trickle out. The Orioles always have at least 5 or 6 every year. And their first one is a local product. Jack Maruskin is the first undrafted free agent signing for the Orioles, a right-handed pitcher out of Frostburg State University, Division II school here in the area. He kind of grew up in the Frederick County area, did JAC, and then pitched at Frostburg, had some awesome stats, 60 strikeouts in 36 innings at Frostburg this year, fastball in the mid to upper 90s with an incredible wipeout slider. His talent was above the area he was pitching at in terms of college level. And he pitched in the draft league this year for the Frederick Keys, and he really impressed in the draft league. So the Orioles go ahead and sign the hometown kid to an undrafted free agent contract. But that'll do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. Hope you learned a lot about Enrique Bradfield Jr., the Orioles' first-round pick. I'll be back tomorrow for one more episode this week. We're talking about the O's second and third picks in the draft. Mac Horvath out of North Carolina, and the earliest pitcher Elias has ever taken in the draft, Jackson Baumeister from Florida State. We'll get a couple of experts on the show tomorrow to talk about those guys and then preview the start of the second half, the weekend series between the Orioles and the Marlins. That's all coming up tomorrow. Until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.